As a sport that is built around the consequences of split-second decisions and freakishly random instances of chance, MMA still manages to keep even the most devoted of fans guessing. And while it's impossible to turn back time, for today's list, we've decided to take a look at some of the most pivotal moments in mixed martial arts' short lifetime and how things could have played out differently. This is the biggest what-ifs in MMA history. The Gracie Way. To kick things off, we take a look back at the earliest days of MMA and the UFC as we know them today. The UFC was originally devised by the Gracie family as a means of singling out the most effective combat sport once and for all. And while kickboxers, sumo wrestlers, judo players, and karate fighters all took part, it was the Brazilian jiu-jitsu of Royce Gracie that came out on top. Of course, this was the expected outcome for the Gracies, but it really does beg the question of what would have come of the UFC had their experiment not worked. Would they have moved on in an attempt to find a different way to legitimize their craft? And would a generation of young fighters have taken influence from the fighting prowess of the family's physically unintimidating participant? Who knows? But if one thing's for sure, it's that the initial splash made by UFC 1 would certainly not have been anywhere near as big. Dana's huge decision. Before he moved into the business of fight promotion, Dana White was a fitness instructor, offering classes to all ages that used boxing as a means of building cardio. However, during the height of his success, a representative of the famed Boston mobster Whitey Bulger came knocking, looking for a piece of the pie. Not willing to pay a criminal like Bulger, White made the decision to leave his home behind him, moving to Las Vegas, Nevada. From there, he found his way into the lives of the Fertitta brothers, Lorenzo and Frank, buying the UFC a few years later. The rest, as they say, was history. But what if he hadn't jumped the gun and dropped his life on a moment's notice? Love him or hate him, Dana is a crucial part of the UFC's success, and without him, we think it's fair to say that the promotion would be completely unrecognizable today. The Fedor failure. For all of the incredibly talented fighters who never once made that walk to the UFC octagon, no athlete stands out more than the legendary Fedor Emelianenko. Known to some as the greatest heavyweight fighter of all time, Fedor's reign as Pride heavyweight champion saw him defeat all comers, beating the finest fighters of his era. However, when the time came to negotiate with the UFC, tensions emerged and the deal was left unsigned. From there, Emelianenko went on to lose his title by way of first-round submission at the hands of Fabrizio Verdum, before fading into his eventual decline. Though they missed the boat on signing a prime version of the Russian star, questions always lingered over how the last emperor would have done against the best of the best as far as the UFC's heavyweight roster was concerned. Chael Sonnen's crucial mistake. Few moments in MMA history are as iconic as the legendary last-gasp triangle choke from Anderson Silva that spared him from losing his UFC middleweight title to Chael Sonnen. To those who are perhaps unaware, Sonnen talked a lot of smack in the lead-up to the fight, and all things considered, he was moments away from pulling off the biggest win in MMA history. After dominating the champion Silva for almost all of the fight up until that point, one crucial error saw the spider catch his prey in a beautifully timed triangle choke in the final round. As you would expect, Sonnen was hugely disappointed with himself. For many fans, the question of what a Chael Sonnen-led era of the UFC middleweight division would have looked like has been a leading what-if for years now, and in reality, we were only about 100 seconds away from it becoming a reality. Breaking Jon Jones. Though the longtime UFC light heavyweight champion Jon Jones has been the top dog at 205 pounds for over a decade, many people forget just how close he came to suffering a major loss early on. Defending his title against the always dangerous Vitor Belfort, Jones was forced into a panic situation early on after the Brazilian managed to catch him in a very deep armbar. While most fighters would have tapped, Jones's mental strength allowed him to fight on, despite Vitor having completely hyperextended his arm. In the end, Jon was able to turn the tide, winning by submission shortly after. And while the effort on his part was commendable, who knows how the world of MMA would have turned out had its greatest talent suffered a setback in such a crucial point in his rise. Big Rig's big moment. For most fans who tuned in for the final welterweight title fight in the run of the legendary Georges St. Pierre, the fact that Johnny Big Rig Hendricks didn't get the judge's decision was a shock. It was a close fight indeed. But as far as divisive scorecards are concerned, no fight comes close to GSP versus Hendricks in terms of legacy. Though Hendricks would later go on to claim the title in St. Pierre's absence, the prestige of defeating one of the greatest of all time is unfortunately missing from his resume. And while perhaps we would have seen a rematch under those circumstances, the fact that he won allowed George to undergo a 4-year hiatus from the sport, eventually returning to win the middleweight crown in 2017. For Hendricks, it was no doubt a tough pill to swallow. But all in all, his efforts on the night itself were truly stunning. The downfall of Ronda Rousey. As soon as Holly Holm stepped away from the defeated Ronda Rousey in the wake of her legendary head kick KO, everyone watching knew they had just witnessed something special. Rousey's striking, which had been hyped up to ridiculous levels, was found out in the most shocking of fashions. Not only was she sloppy and out of her depth against the more seasoned Holly Holm, but her mental fragility was also laid out for the world to see. This was a winner, and unfortunately one who did not know how to lose. But what if Ronda had managed to get the fight to the mat? If she had managed to find her way to that patented armbar before her shortcomings on the feet could play a part? It's hard to imagine just how far she could have gone, knowing what we know now. But after another impressive win in a sold-out Australian stadium, we think it's fair to say that her star power would have been even greater. Cain Velasquez's struggles. Those who witnessed the prime years of Cain Velasquez often cite him as the single greatest example of a heavyweight fighter the sport has ever known. Now, that's a matter of opinion, of course, but if one thing is for certain, it's that Cain's best years were unfortunately lost due to a string of recurring injuries. Known as one of the hardest-working fighters in the game, Velasquez's near-inhuman cardio comes as a result of his work ethic in the gym. However, the body can only take so much, and in the end, Cain's mind proved to be stronger than his body. Between the years of 2016 and 2021, Cain has fought on just 2 occasions, never fully finding his way back into the consistency that defined his earlier run. Had he managed to avoid these injuries, we could easily be talking about one of the single most impressive fighters of all time, across all divisions. UFC 196's late switch-up. It's easy to forget just how quickly Conor McGregor had planned to leave the featherweight division in pursuit of his dual-weight world champion status back in 2016. Originally slated to take on the lightweight king Rafael dos Anjos, a late injury to RDA forced him out, leading to the short-notice call-up answered by one Nate Diaz. Of course, we all know what happened next. The biggest rivalry in MMA was formed, and McGregor was forced to accept some shortcomings in his game, with his cardio issues laid out for the world to see. He would eventually come back looking better than ever the second time around, before moving on to finally claim the 155-pound title at UFC 205. But if Dos Anjos had been his opponent at UFC 196 instead, chances are that Conor's entire career from then on would have been completely unrecognizable from how it turned out. It really does send the mind wandering, doesn't it? Daniel Cormier's final push. And finally, we come to the last what-if on our list. The feud that existed between the legendary light heavyweights Jon Jones and Daniel Cormier culminated in a pair of heated showdowns that saw Jones eventually seal off the rivalry with a pair of victories. And while the first fight wasn't especially close, in the second, despite some persistent bodywork from the then challenger, Cormier was showing some promise. Of course, in the end, Jones was able to make good on a promise he made several years prior, finishing DC with a head kick. But what if Daniel had learned from his mistake? What if he had finally overcome the challenge that was Jon Bones Jones? Would his path have led him back to heavyweight? Would we have been looking at a trilogy bout between these two all-time greats? What's your own biggest what-if in MMA history? And how do you think a change in its outcome could have affected the entire landscape of the sport? Be sure to let us know in the comments section below, before subscribing to the channel to stay up to date with all of our latest uploads. Thanks for watching.